The sign was still there. Faded, cracked, barely readable after years of Texas sun beating down on the old wood, but still there. Claire stood in the dirt, one bag on her shoulder, $100 less in her pocket, and stared at those 2 words above the barn door, like they were written in a language she almost remembered. Merritt and daughter. She had never noticed that sign before, not once in 19 years of living on this land. And now, standing outside the only structure in the world that still had her name on it, she wondered if her father had put it there for a reason. If maybe, somehow, he had always known it would come to this. That one day she would be standing right here, alone, with nowhere left to go. But that moment comes later in the story. First, you need to understand what it cost her to get there. Claire Merritt grew up in Fredericksburg, Texas, in the heart of the hill country, where the land rolls and the sky goes on forever, and families have been working the same soil for 4 and 5 generations without thinking twice about it. Her father Dale was that kind of man, 3rd generation on the same property, hands like leather, voice like gravel, the kind of quiet that fills a room without saying a word. He had raised Claire alone since she was 9 years old, after her mother packed a bag one Tuesday morning and drove away and never came back. No phone call, no letter, no explanation, just gone. Dale never talked about it. He just adjusted. Made Claire breakfast every morning before school, sat with her at the kitchen table while she did homework, drove her to every school event without being asked. He was not a man who knew how to say the things he felt, but Claire never once doubted that she was loved. What Dale wanted for Claire was simple. He wanted her to study, to have choices he never had. The ranch was his world, not hers, and he was deliberate about that. He kept her in school, kept her away from the hard labor, pushed her toward books and grades and possibilities that went beyond the property line. He used to say, and Claire could still hear his voice when she thought about it, that the land would always be there, that she should go find out what else the world had to offer first. She graduated high school in May, 18 years on that same piece of hill country soil, and for the first time she was starting to think about what came next. College, maybe, or at least a plan. She had the whole summer ahead of her. She had her father. She had time. She had 23 days. That is how long Dale Merritt lived after Claire's graduation. 23 days. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in late June, the kind of morning that starts beautiful and turns into the worst day of your life before you even finish your first cup of coffee. The tractor rolled on the south slope, the same slope Dale had worked 1,000 times. Nobody saw it happen. By the time anyone reached him, it was already too late. Claire was in town when she got the call. She drove back to the ranch going 90 miles an hour on a 2-lane road, and she doesn't remember a single second of that drive. She just remembers arriving, and knowing before she even got out of the truck. The days that followed were a blur of people in the kitchen, and casseroles on the counter, and neighbors she barely recognized saying things she couldn't hear. Sandra handled everything. Sandra, who had been Dale's wife for 7 years, who had moved into the Merritt house with 2 suitcases and a very particular idea of what was hers, handled all of it with the kind of calm that Claire would only understand later. Sandra Merritt was not a cruel woman in the way that people imagine cruelty. She did not yell, she did not threaten, she simply planned. She had been planning, Claire would eventually learn, for most of those 7 years. Patient the way certain things are patient, the way a document waits in a drawer, the way a signature dries on a page. Sandra had married Dale Merritt because Dale Merritt had land, and land in the hill country does not lose value, and Sandra understood that better than most. The will was read 8 days after the funeral. Bobby Calhoun, who had handled Dale's legal affairs for 30 years, and who had the kind of face that holds bad news the way old wood holds water, sat across from Claire in his office on Main Street and read every word carefully. Claire listened, and as she listened, she felt something inside her go very, very still. The ranch, the house, the equipment, the vehicles, the accounts, everything to Sandra. 100%. No conditions, no provisions for Claire, not a single line. Bobby stopped reading and looked at her over the top of his glasses. There was one additional item, he said quietly. One structure listed separately from the main property. The old barn on the north edge of the land, designated for transfer to Claire Ann Merritt, to be purchased by her at fair assessed value. Claire asked him to repeat that. He did. The barn was assessed at $100. Sandra had already prepared the bill of sale. It was sitting on Bobby's desk in a manila envelope with Claire's name written on the front in Sandra's handwriting. Claire sat in that chair for a long time without speaking. She thought about the 23 days. She thought about the tractor on the south slope. She thought about her father's hands and his voice and the way he used to sit at the kitchen table while she did homework, not saying anything, just being there. And she thought about Sandra sitting across the ranch house right now, in Dale's chair, in Dale's kitchen, on Dale's land, waiting. Bobby said something. Claire didn't hear it. She picked up the manila envelope, stood up and walked out. She drove to the ranch. Sandra was on the porch. She had the kind of stillness that comes from knowing you have already won. She watched Claire pull up without changing her expression. Claire got out of the truck. She walked up to the porch. She put $100 in cash on the railing between them. She looked at Sandra for exactly 3 seconds. Then she picked up her bag from the truck bed, turned around, and walked north toward the barn. She heard Sandra say something behind her, something that sounded almost like satisfaction. She did not turn around. The barn was in worse shape than she remembered. She had not spent much time out here growing up. Dale had kept this part of the property mostly to himself. The east wall had a section that had partially given way, held together by a rusted metal beam that her father had clearly welded in at some point, the kind of repair that says, "I know this is not perfect, but it will hold." The main doors were warped, but they opened. Inside, the smell hit her first. Dry cedar and iron rust and something underneath that she couldn't name, old and dense and familiar, in a way that made no sense because she had barely been inside this building in her life. The floor was dirt, except for one corner where Dale had poured a concrete slab. She remembered him mentioning it once, something about drainage. She hadn't thought about it again until now, standing in the middle of a barn she had just paid $100 for, looking around at the only thing in the world with her name on it. Above the main door on the inside, the same sign, Merritt and Daughter, painted directly onto the wood, not a separate piece, not something you could take down, part of the barn itself. Claire sat down on the dirt floor with her back against the wall and looked at it for a long time. She did not cry that night. She wanted to. The grief was there, enormous and close, pressing against her chest from the inside like something that needed to get out. But crying felt like it would cost something she couldn't afford to spend right now. So she sat with her back against the wall, and she breathed, and she looked at those 2 words above the door, and she let herself feel exactly one thing. Her father had painted that sign himself. She knew his handwriting. She knew the way he made certain letters. That sign was his hand. Merritt and Daughter. Not Merritt Ranch, not Merritt Property, not a brand or a business name. Merritt and Daughter, like a partnership, like a promise made to someone who hadn't been asked yet. She fell asleep on the dirt floor with her bag under her head, and the Texas night coming in through the gaps in the east wall, and the stars visible through a crack in the roof that ran almost the full length of the beam. If you had seen her there that night, you would have thought she had nothing. And you would have been right. She had $100 less in her pocket. She had a barn with a broken wall and a leaking roof and a dirt floor. She had no house, no vehicle, other than the truck Sandra had already told Bobby would need to be returned. No savings, no plan. What she did not know, lying there on that dirt floor, is that her father had been in this barn 3 weeks before he died, that he had spent a full afternoon here, alone, that he had moved certain things, that he had sealed certain things, that he had written something down and folded it carefully and put it where he needed it to be. Dale Merritt had discovered something about Sandra 7 years into their marriage. He had discovered it quietly, the way he did everything, by paying attention to small things that didn't add up. A document with a signature that didn't look right, a deed that referenced a transfer he didn't remember authorizing. He had gone to Bobby Calhoun not to make noise, but to understand what he was looking at. Bobby had confirmed his suspicion, The signatures had been forged. Land documents had been altered. Sandra had been quietly, methodically moving portions of the Merritt property into a shell company registered in her name. She had been doing it for years. Dale had 3 weeks to decide what to do about it. 3 weeks to figure out how to protect what was his and what was Claire's. He had started the process with Bobby. He had gathered the evidence. And then the Tuesday morning on the South Slope happened, and Dale Merritt ran out of time. But he had not run out of foresight, because Dale Merritt knew his daughter. He knew that if something happened to him before he could fix what Sandra had done, Claire would be left with nothing. He knew Sandra well enough to know exactly how it would go. He knew which structure on the property Sandra would dismiss as worthless. He knew where to put what needed to be found. The concrete slab in the corner of the barn had a seam in it that was not a crack. You would not notice it unless you were looking, unless you ran your hand along the edge and felt where the concrete had been poured in 2 separate stages, the second one a perfect rectangle just large enough to cover a tin box. Claire did not find it that first night. She found it on the 3rd day. The first 2 days she spent doing what survival requires when you have nothing and nowhere to go. She found a water source, a spigot on the outside of the barn that still worked. She drove the truck into town on the last day she had it and bought food with what cash she had left after the $100, enough to last a week if she was careful. She bought a sleeping bag from the hardware store. She drove back to the barn, parked the truck where Sandra couldn't see it from the house, and started thinking about what came next. May Hutchins came on the 2nd day. May was 81 years old and had lived on the property adjacent to the Merritts for longer than Claire had been alive. She arrived at the barn door with a casserole dish and the kind of expression that doesn't ask permission to tell you the truth. She looked at Claire standing in the barn doorway and said, "Your daddy loved you more than this land, and that is saying something because he loved this land more than most people love anything." Claire asked her what she meant. May set the casserole dish down on a fence post and looked at her steadily. She said that Dale had come to see her about a month before he died, that he had seemed worried in a way she had never seen him worried before, that he had told her something she didn't fully understand at the time, but that she had been thinking about ever since the funeral. He had told May that the barn had everything Claire would ever need, that if anything ever happened before he got things sorted out, the barn was where she should look. Not the house, not the land, the barn. May had assumed he meant the barn itself, the structure, the value of the property. Standing there looking at Claire on that 2nd day, she was starting to think he had meant something else entirely. Claire stood very still for a moment. Then she asked May to stay while she looked at something. She went back inside the barn and walked directly to the corner with the concrete slab. She got down on her knees and ran both hands across the surface slowly, the way you do when you're looking for something you can feel but not see. She found the seam on the 2nd pass. The rectangle was there exactly the way she suddenly knew it would be, a secondary pour, patient and precise, everything her father did. She did not have the right tools to lift it that day, but she knew it was there. She sat back on her heels and put one hand flat on the concrete and stayed like that for a long moment. May was watching from the doorway. Claire looked up at her and said, He knew exactly what was going to happen, and he put something here for me." May nodded like this was the answer she had been waiting to hear. That evening, Claire borrowed a pry bar and a hammer from May's tool shed. She made herself eat first. She made herself sleep a few hours. She wanted to be clear-headed when she opened it. She wanted to give it the weight it deserved. The 3rd morning, she woke before sunrise. The hill country was still and cool, and the light was just beginning to come in through the crack in the roof, falling in a thin line across the dirt floor. Claire picked up the pry bar. She walked to the corner. She got down on her knees and she started to work the seam. The concrete came up in one clean piece, the way it had been designed to, the rectangle lifting like a door, pivoting on a hinge that Dale had set into the pour on one side. Underneath was a cavity, deliberately shaped, lined with a piece of old canvas to keep moisture out. Inside the cavity was a tin box. It was the kind of box that holds documents, rectangular, latched but not locked. The outside was wrapped in a second layer of canvas, tied with a piece of baling twine. The knot was Dale's knot. Claire recognized it the way you recognize something you have seen your whole life without ever naming it. She sat down cross-legged on the dirt floor, with the box in her lap, and the thin line of early light falling across her hands, and she held it for a long time, without opening it. May arrived at 7 in the morning and found her still sitting there. She sat down next to Claire on the dirt floor without being asked, her 81-year-old knees making their complaints, and she put one hand on Claire's arm and said nothing. Claire opened the box. The cash was on top, bundled neatly, secured with rubber bands, the kind of savings that accumulates slowly over years of small decisions, putting away a little here, a little there, never spending on things that weren't necessary. Claire didn't count it right away. She set it aside carefully and looked at what was underneath. A letter, folded 3 times, her name on the front in her father's handwriting. She did not open it yet. She set it on her knee and looked at the next thing. A small cloth pouch, the kind used for seeds, drawn shut with a thin cord. She loosened the cord and looked inside. Seeds of 3 different varieties, each separated into smaller paper packets labeled in Dale's handwriting. Beside each label a note, 1 line each. Where to plant, what kind of soil, when they do best. The labels identified them as heirloom varieties, names she didn't fully recognize, old names that sounded like they belonged to a different century. She set the pouch down gently. Beneath it was a folded piece of paper, larger than the letter, thicker. She unfolded it and found a hand-drawn map. The Merritt property, rendered in her father's careful lines, every structure marked, every boundary noted. And adjacent to the main property, connected by a dotted line that extended north. A second parcel outlined in red ink. 42 acres. Her father's handwriting in the corner of that parcel. Purchased in full, clear title, registered separately under Claire A. Merritt. Claire stared at that for a long time. Beneath the map, in a separate envelope sealed with tape, were documents. She recognized a deed. She recognized legal correspondence with Bobby Calhoun's letterhead. She recognized what appeared to be copies of the forged documents, the originals alongside Sandra's versions, the differences visible if you knew what you were looking at. She set the documents aside. She picked up the letter. She unfolded it. And she read what her father had written to her in the weeks before he died, in the careful, unhurried handwriting of a man who did not waste words. He told her he was sorry he hadn't fixed things in time. He told her he had tried. He told her about Sandra and the documents and what Bobby had found, and he told her that he had put everything she needed in the box because he needed to know that if something happened, she would not be left with nothing. He told her about the 42 acres, that he had bought them 3 years ago without telling anyone, registered directly in her name, that they were hers, clear and free, and that no fraudulent will could touch them because they had never been his to give. He told her about the seeds, that they had been his father's before him and his grandfather's before that, heirloom varieties that the family had grown on hill country soil for 3 generations, that they were nearly impossible to find now, that there were people who would pay real money for what grew from them, and more importantly, that what grew from them was good and true and tasted like something that hadn't been bred for shipping. He told her to talk to Bobby, that Bobby knew everything and was waiting for her. He told her about the sign above the door, that he had painted it the year she was born, that he had always intended this barn to be hers, that even when he thought he would have time to hand it over properly, with the land and the house and everything around it, he had wanted her to have a place that was only hers, with only her name on it, that Merritt and Daughter was not a business name. It was how he thought of himself, as her father. First, before the land, before the ranch, before any of it. Claire finished reading the letter. She sat on the dirt floor of the barn with the tin box open in her lap and the early Texas light coming through the crack in the roof and May Hutchins sitting beside her with one hand on her arm, and she cried. Not the careful, rationed kind of crying she had been holding back since the accident. The real kind, the kind that has been waiting for the right moment, the moment when grief and love arrive at exactly the same time, when you understand that the thing you lost and the thing you were given are the same thing, just wearing different faces. May held her arm and didn't say a word. Outside the barn, the hill country was waking up, the light coming gold across the grass, the cedar and the limestone, and the particular smell of Texas morning that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Inside, a 19-year-old girl was sitting on a dirt floor reading a letter from her dead father, learning for the first time that she had never been forgotten. Not for a single day, not for a single decision. When she finished crying, she wiped her face with the back of her hand. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box. She looked at May. She said, "I need to call Bobby Calhoun." May nodded. She already had her phone out. But before Claire made that call, before any of what came next began, she did one thing. She stood up. She walked to the main door of the barn and pushed it open so the morning light came all the way in. She stood in the doorway and looked up at the sign above her head, Merritt and Daughter. She put one hand flat against the old painted wood. She stood there for a moment with the sun on her face and 42 acres of her land stretching north behind her, and a tin box full of her father's love sitting on the dirt floor inside. Then she took a breath, turned around and went back in. There was work to do, and that is a good place to pause and ask you something. If you had been Claire that morning, standing in that doorway with nothing but a broken barn, a box of seeds, and a letter from your father, would you have believed it was enough to start over? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story is moving you the way it is moving me, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because what Claire builds from here, nobody saw coming, least of all Sandra. Bobby Calhoun did not seem surprised when Claire walked into his office that same morning with a tin box under her arm and May Hutchins behind her. He looked at the box. He looked at Claire. He let out a long, slow breath that carried in it 30 years of knowing Dale Merritt and understanding, finally, what his old friend had been doing in those last weeks. He said, "Your father called me 2 days before the accident, told me he had secured everything, told me where it was, told me that if Claire came to see me, I should help her with whatever she needed." Claire set the box on his desk. Bobby opened it carefully, handled each document the way attorneys handle things that matter, which is to say with his full attention and no wasted movement. He went through the fraud documents first, the originals alongside Sandra's altered versions. He was quiet for a long time. Then he looked up and said, "This is enough." Claire asked him what that meant exactly. He said it meant that Sandra Merritt had committed fraud in the preparation of a legal document, that the evidence in front of him was clear and documented, and that Dale had done the work with a kind of thoroughness that made Bobby's job considerably easier than it might have been. He said that the 42 acres registered in Claire's name had never been part of Dale's estate, and therefore could not be touched by the fraudulent will. He said that reversing the rest of it would take time and would not be simple, but that with what was in that box it was no longer a question of if, it was a question of when. He told her not to say a word to Sandra. Claire said that was not going to be a problem. She drove back to the barn. She sat for a while with the map spread out on the dirt floor, tracing the boundary lines of the 42 acres with one finger. North of the barn, stretching up into a gentle slope she had walked a few times as a kid, without knowing it belonged in any particular way to anyone. The soil up there was different from the main ranch, darker, denser, the kind of soil that held water better, that took a seed and kept it. She thought about the seeds in the cloth pouch, about the handwritten notes alongside each label, where to plant, what kind of soil, when they do best. Her father had not left her directions. He had left her a map. She started that afternoon. She did not have farming experience in the way that sounds when you say it out loud. She had grown up on a ranch, and she understood soil and seasons in the background, way that children absorb things without being taught them directly. But row crops and garden cultivation were not things Dale had spent much time on. The Merritt property had always been cattle and grass and cedar, not beds and seeds and careful tending. What Claire had was the notes, and May Hutchins. May had grown up farming. Not the large-scale commercial kind, the old kind, the kind her own grandparents had done on a smaller piece of hill country land 2 properties over. She knew heirloom varieties the way some people know old songs, by name and by feel and by what they remembered tasting like when they were young. When Claire showed her the seed packets and Dale's labels, May went quiet in a particular way. The way people go quiet when they recognize something they thought was gone. She picked up one of the packets and held it carefully. She said, "I haven't seen this variety since my mother grew it. I was maybe 7 years old." Claire asked her if she knew what to do with it. May looked at her like that was possibly the easiest question anyone had asked her in years. They started with 3 beds on the gentler part of the north slope, the section Dale's map had marked with a single word in the corner. Start here. The soil was exactly what the notes said it would be. May taught Claire how to prepare the beds properly, how deep, how wide, how to read the ground before you commit a seed to it. Claire learned fast. She had her father's patience and her father's hands, and it turned out that was most of what the work required. The days had a rhythm now. Early mornings in the beds, afternoons working on the barn itself, clearing, cleaning, assessing what could be saved and what needed replacing. Bobby called every few days with updates. May came every morning and stayed until noon and sometimes longer. Sandra was silent. That silence lasted 11 days. Then it ended. The letter arrived through Bobby's office from Sandra's attorney, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who operated out of San Antonio and whose letterhead made his fees clear before you read a single word. The letter stated that Claire was occupying a structure that had been properly transferred in the estate, that the transfer had been for residential or storage purposes and did not include rights to the adjacent land, and that Sandra Merritt, as primary estate beneficiary, was requesting that Claire vacate the property within 30 days, pending a full review of the property boundaries. Bobby called Claire the same afternoon. He read her the letter. He was quiet for a moment after. Then he said she found out about the 42 acres. Claire asked him how. He said property records are public, that someone who was paying attention would notice a parcel registered in a 19-year-old's name adjacent to a ranch that had just changed hands. That Sandra was paying attention. He told Claire that this was actually good news, that Sandra's move meant she was scared, not confident. That scared people make mistakes. That Gerald Pruitt's letter was a pressure tactic, not a legal position, and that the moment they filed their response with the fraud documents attached, the pressure would shift very rapidly in a different direction. Claire asked him how long. He said he needed 3 weeks to prepare the filing correctly, that he wanted it to be complete and that he wanted it to be unambiguous, that Dale had handed them a case that was almost impossible to lose if they were careful and patient. Claire said she could be patient. She went back to the beds. The seeds had been in the ground for 9 days by then, and the first signs were just beginning to show, the particular green of something new pushing through dark soil, tentative and exact. Claire crouched in the dirt every morning and looked at those first shoots the way you look at something you are not entirely sure is real yet. They were real. They came up steady and clean, and in the weeks that followed, they grew in a way that made May shake her head slowly and say things under her breath that sounded like gratitude. The barn was coming together in parallel. Claire worked on it in the afternoons with whatever materials she could afford from the cash in the tin box, buying lumber and hardware in town and hauling it back in the truck May had lent her. She replaced the worst sections of the east wall first, working from Dale's original repair outward, using the rusted beam as her anchor the way he had intended it. The roof crack came next, a 2-day job that left her arms aching and her confidence considerably higher than it had been when she started. The rope pulley system she left exactly as it was, cleaned it, oiled the hardware, tested the function. It worked perfectly. She left it hanging from the center beam because it was her father's, and because it was useful, and because some things do not need to be changed, only appreciated. The interior took shape gradually. She cleared the floor except for the corner with the concrete slab, which she left intact. She built a set of rough shelves along the north interior wall, long and sturdy, the kind that could hold weight. She framed a wide opening in the south-facing wall, replacing warped wood with a set of folding doors that could open completely when the weather allowed, letting the hill country air and light come all the way through. She was building a farm stand, not in the abstract way that you talk about plans before they exist, in the specific, physical, nail-by-nail way. She had a picture in her mind that had come from the map and the seeds and her father's notes and the particular quality of the light that came through the south wall in the late afternoon. She built toward that picture every day. Bobby filed the response 4 weeks after Sandra's letter. He sent Claire a copy the morning it was submitted. The cover document was 3 pages. The attachments ran to 47. Gerald Pruitt's office called Bobby within 6 hours of receiving it. Bobby relayed the conversation to Claire that evening. He said Gerald Pruitt had apparently used language that suggested his client had not been fully transparent with him about certain aspects of the estate preparation. He said there was likely going to be a period of reassessment on Sandra's end. He said Claire should expect things to get quieter before they got louder again. He was right about the quiet. It lasted 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, the first heirloom tomatoes began to ripen on the north slope. They were a variety that May said had no equivalent in any grocery store she had ever visited. Dense and dark and sweet in a way that sat in your mouth differently than anything bred for shelf life and shipping. Claire brought a basket of them to May's house, and they sat at the kitchen table and ate them with salt and nothing else, and May cried quietly into her napkin and said, "I had forgotten what a tomato was supposed to taste like." Word got around. Small towns in Texas move information the way weather moves across open land. Within 2 weeks, Claire had 6 people who had asked, through May, if there would be anything available to buy. By the end of that month, the number was closer to 20. She opened the farm stand on a Saturday morning in late September. The barn doors folded open to the south, the shelves full of what the first harvest had produced. The tomatoes and 2 varieties of squash and the dried seed packets that May had helped her prepare from the first generation of growth. She had made a small hand-painted sign with prices. She had borrowed a card reader from a neighbor who sold things at the Fredericksburg farmers market. She had put fresh cedar boughs on either side of the door, the way she had seen her father do for certain occasions, without ever knowing why he did it. May Hutchins was her first customer. She arrived before anyone else, walked up to the stand, picked up a basket of tomatoes, and set a $20 bill on the counter without looking at the price. Claire told her the tomatoes were $11. May said she knew, and she pushed the 20 across the counter and looked at Claire steadily and said, "Your daddy would be proud," in a voice that meant she was not talking about the tomatoes. Claire held it together until May turned around to walk back to her truck. Then she pressed both hands flat on the counter and looked down at the cedar boughs and breathed. By noon that first Saturday, she had sold out of everything on the shelves. She stood in the open barn in the afternoon light with an empty cash box that was no longer empty, and the south doors folded wide and the hill country stretching in every direction, and she thought about her father crouched in this same space, sealing a tin box into a concrete floor, thinking about her, planning for her, leaving her exactly what she needed in exactly the place he knew she would find it. The legal proceedings moved to their conclusion in the following weeks. Bobby had not overstated the strength of the case. The fraud documents were clear and the forgeries were verifiable, and Gerald Pruitt, whose professional reputation was not something he intended to attach to a losing cause, withdrew his representation of Sandra midway through the process. A substitute attorney entered for Sandra briefly, and then also withdrew. Sandra appeared at the barn one morning near the end of October. She came alone. She parked her car on the gravel path and walked up to where Claire was working in the north beds and stood there for a moment without speaking. Claire kept working. Sandra said that she had not expected any of this, that she had believed the documents were legitimate, that she wanted Claire to know that she had not known about Dale's private land purchase. Claire did not look up from the bed she was tending. She said, "Bobby will be in touch about the timeline for the property transfer." Sandra stood there a moment longer. Then she walked back to her car and drove away. Claire watched her go. She felt less than she expected to feel. Not forgiveness, not yet. Maybe not ever in the full sense. But something quieter than anger. The feeling that comes when a thing that has been pulling at you finally stops pulling. Not because it was resolved in the way you imagined when you were lying on a dirt floor with nothing, but because the ground underneath you turned out to be solid. Because your father, in the only way he had left available to him, had made sure of it. The legal process concluded in November. The fraudulent will was invalidated. The Merritt ranch property, the main house, the equipment, the accounts, everything Sandra had taken, reverted to Claire as the sole legitimate heir. The 42 acres, which had never been in question, remained exactly as they were, registered in her name, clear title, exactly as Dale had arranged 3 years before any of this began. Sandra left Fredericksburg. Nobody in town made much comment about it. Claire moved back into the main house in December. She stood in the kitchen doorway on the first morning and looked at the table where her father had sat with her while she did homework, not saying anything, just being there. She made coffee, she sat down at the table, she was there for a long time. The barn she kept is the farm stand. She had never considered moving the operation into one of the outbuildings closer to the house. The barn was where it belonged. She expanded the shelving in January and added a second opening on the east wall to improve the flow on busy Saturdays. She installed proper lighting for the winter months when the days came short. She kept the rope pulley system exactly as it was. She repainted the sign above the main door in February on a cold, clear hill country morning, with her breath showing in the air and a brush in her hand, and May Hutchins watching from the doorway drinking coffee out of a thermos. She used the same color her father had used, as close as she could match it from the faded original, a deep barn red that sat against the weathered wood like it had always been there. Merritt and daughter. She stepped back and looked at it. May said, "He would have wanted it darker on the second M." Claire looked at her. May smiled into her thermos. Claire turned back to the sign and made the second M darker. Then she stood there a while longer with the cold morning around her, and the sign bright above the door, and 42 acres of her father's planning stretching north behind her into the hill country sky. By spring, the farm stand had a waiting list for the heirloom tomatoes. 3 varieties, each from Dale's original seed stock, each grown on the north slope in soil his map had identified, decades before Claire ever thought to look at it. The dried seed packets had become a category of their own, people driving from Kerrville and Bourne, and sometimes San Antonio, for varieties they could not find anywhere else. Seeds from a time before mass agriculture had reduced everything to what travels well and stores long. Claire began saving seed from the strongest plants of each generation, the way the notes said to do, the way her grandfather and great-grandfather had done before her, maintaining the line. She labeled each packet in handwriting that, she noticed one afternoon, had started to look like her father's. May became a permanent presence at the Saturday market, selling preserves and dried herbs from her own property alongside Claire's harvest. Other neighbors followed. By summer, the barn doors opened every Saturday morning to a line of vendors setting up alongside the main shelving, and by 10 o'clock, the gravel path was full of cars from as far as an hour's drive away. Claire hired 2 people from town to help with the harvest and the Saturday setup, both of them younger than her, both of them learning the same things she was learning, the particular attention that old seed varieties require, the patience of soil that has been properly prepared, the difference between growing fast and growing right. She enrolled in an agricultural program at the community college in the fall, not because she needed it to do what she was already doing, but because she wanted the language for it, the science underneath the practice. She drove 40 minutes each way twice a week and came home to the farm and applied what she had learned before the information had a chance to become abstract. The tin box she kept in the kitchen, not hidden, on the shelf above the window where the morning light hit it first. The letter was inside, folded the same 3 folds, her name on the front in her father's handwriting. She did not read it often. She did not need to. She knew what it said. She had carried every word of it inside her since that morning on the dirt floor with May's hand on her arm and the thin line of early light falling across her hands. What her father had written in that letter was not a plan. It was not instructions or a strategy or a set of directions. It was something simpler and more lasting than any of that. It was an account of how he had thought about her. Every day, every decision, every piece of land purchased and every seed saved and every careful choice made, in the years before she was old enough to understand that choices were being made on her behalf. He had thought of himself as her father first. Before the land, before the ranch, before any of it, she thought about that on ordinary days. Tuesday mornings in the beds, Saturday afternoons when the last customer of the day drove away down the gravel path, winter evenings at the kitchen table with the tin box visible on the shelf and the hill country dark and quiet outside the window. She thought about it most on the mornings she drove up to the north slope before anyone else arrived, when the light was still low and the dew was still on the beds and the heirloom plants were doing what 3 generations of care had prepared them to do, growing slow and dense and true in the same soil her father had marked on a hand-drawn map and left for her in a box under a concrete floor in a barn with her name painted above the door. A barn that Sandra had sold her for $100 because she thought it was worth nothing. A barn that turned out to be worth everything. There is something Claire says now when people ask her how she went from sleeping on a dirt floor to running one of the most talked about farm stands in the hill country. She says she did not build it alone. She says it was built by her father before she knew she needed it, and by May Hutchins, who showed up with a casserole dish and the truth on the second day, and by everyone in town who drove down that gravel path on a Saturday morning and picked up a basket of tomatoes and came back the following week. She says it was built out of seeds, literal ones in cloth pouches labeled in a dead man's handwriting, and the other kind, the ones a person plants in someone else without ever saying they've done it, in the hope that somewhere down the line, when the ground is ready and the conditions are right, something will grow. Dale Merritt planted those seeds in his daughter for 19 years. He just didn't get to see the harvest. She sees it for him now. Every single Saturday morning when the barn doors fold open and the hill country light comes all the way through, and the sign above the door is freshly painted and bright and exactly the right darkness on the second M. Merritt and daughter. Still there. If this story stayed with you, I want to ask you something before you go. Think about someone in your life who planted something in you without ever making a big deal of it. A parent, a neighbor, a teacher, someone who showed up with a casserole dish and the truth when you needed it most. If that person came to mind just now, share this story with them today, not tomorrow, today. Because sometimes the people who gave us the most have no idea what grew from what they planted. Leave a comment and tell me, what was the most unexpected place you ever found exactly what you needed? I read every single one. And if you want more stories like Claire's, stories about people who built something nobody expected out of the least likely places, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. Every week there is a new one, and I promise you, this was not the last barn with a secret inside. Thank you for being here. See you next week.